Baruch Hashem. Today's daf yomi is Zevachim Yunches, Zevachim 58. Today's daf yomi, we're going to start with the new chapter, which is the chapter called Kodshei Kadashim, which is the Holy of Holies. So what a beautiful name for a chapter. And we start by saying Kodshei Kadashim, the most sacred offerings, the holiest of the holy offerings, Sheshachtan Berosh HaMizbeach. They slaughter them on the top of the altar. So what will be the law then? So Rabbi Yossi says, Ki'u nishchatu b'tzafon. We know that the Kodshei Kadashim, we've already learned in our tractate that the korbanos that are Kodshei Kadashim, the most sacred, they have to be slaughtered in the north. So Rabbi Yossi says we're going to look at it as though, even though they're slaughtering it on the top of the altar, we're going to view it as though it was slaughtered in the north. Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda says, "Mechatzim mizbeach u'daron kedaron, mechatzim mizbeach u'tzafon ketzafon." From half of the mizbeach towards the south is like the south, and from half to the north is like the north. Tosfos points out that the language of the Mishnah is b'di'evet, is if you did it there. Tosfos says midiaraisa, but biblically speaking, you could shech there even lechatchila, even initially, because we're going to cite a pasuk. So he says maybe the reason why the Mishnah used the language of b'di'evet, of ex post facto, is because there's a concern that the animal might go to the bathroom on the altar before it's slaughtered, and so therefore he used the language of b'di'evet. So we see that according to Rabbi Yossi, you could slaughter it on the altar because it says though you slaughtered it in the north, whereas according to Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, you can only slaughter on the northern half of the altar for the Kodshei Kadashim, not the southern half. So Amar Rav Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Asi says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that Rabbi Yossi, who says you could slaughter it on the altar, he was of the position, says Rabbi Yochanan. Omer Ayi Rabbi Yossi Kul Mizbeach B'Tzafon Kai. It's because the entire altar was actually in the north, in the northern part of the courtyard. And since you have to slaughter the animal in the northern part of the courtyard, it's okay to slaughter it on the altar. So if that's the case, my ki'ilu, what does it mean when it says though, as though it was slaughtered? So the answer is we're on 58a, Harold Boker Tov. Ma'al might have said, but he might have said, well, you can't slaughter it on the north, even though the northern part of the altar is, even though the altar is in the northern part of the courtyard, because the verse says you have to slaughter it al yerach hamizbeach, which means next to the altar. So you might have thought it's no good, Beleka, and since it's not next to it's no good, kamashval, and it's okay as long as it's on the, even it's on the altar, as long as it's in the north. So that's the way Rabbi Yochanan explains. That's why Rav Asi explains in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yossi's position, they could slaughter the animal in the north because he said there's Kodshei Kadashim, because he says they could slaughter on the altar because he says the altar was in the northern part of the courtyard. So Rabbi Zera challenged Rav Asi, says Amalei Rabbi Zera Rav Asi. Rabbi Zera says to Rav Asi, Amiato Rabbi Yossi by Rabbi Huda, the second opinion in our Mishnah says you can only slaughter it on the northern part of the courtyard, on the northern part of the altar, the northern half. So according to Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, you mean to say that he's in the position that half the altar is in the north, and that's what you could slaughter on, and the other half is in the south, and therefore you can't slaughter the Kodshei Kadashim on that. If you want to say that is in fact his position, but you yourself said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that Modi Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, that Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda would admit that if he went off the altar and slaughtered it on the ground right there, it's disqualified. What does it mean, kenegdam b'karka? The Gemara is going to have to take up that phrase, but for some reason, what we could say now is that it means if you didn't slaughter it on the altar itself, but it slaughtered it somehow either next to or underneath it, it's disqualified. And so we see that area was not part of the northern part of the courtyard. So Amrlay, so Rav Asi responds to Rabbi Zera, no, Hachika Amar Rabbi Yochanan. This is what Rabbi Yochanan was saying. Shneim Mikra Echadarshu. Both Rebbe Yossi in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, have their teaching about slaughtering on the top of an altar. Where Rabbi Yossi says everything is okay, the entire altar. Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda says half the altar is okay. They both expound it from a verse. What does the pasuk say? V'zavachta alav es oasecha v'es shilamecha. Says that you shall make an altar in the courtyard and you shall slaughter upon it your oos and your shlamim. Oos is kachi kachim and shlamim is kachi kalam. So Rabbi Yossi savar kulo la'ola v'chul shlamim. Rabbi Yossi's other position, since it says your ola and your shlamim, says you could slaughter everything on both on the altar, the ola and the shlamim, meaning over the entire courtyard. Good morning. We're on the 58A, around 10 lines on the top. Whereas Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda savar chatzio ola v'chatzio shlamim. He says no. That verse is telling us half for the ola and half for the shlamim. These sakadaitach kul ola kosher. Because if really the implication of that verse is that the entire altar is okay to slaughter the ola on, hash to kul ola kosher kul shlamim mibai. It's once we've established that the ola, which is kache kachim, is the entire altar is kosher for it. Would we even need to say that the shlamim is kosher? Shlamim is a lesser holy offering. So what would Rabbi? So therefore, it means half is kosher for the ola and half is kosher for the shlamim. The idach, whereas Rabbi Yossi responds, no, itzchach, you would still need it because zalkadai dechamina, you might have thought that you couldn't slaughter the shlamim at all. That we allow you to bring the altar, the ola on top of the altar to slaughter it because maybe you run out of space because it can only be slaughtered in the north. But aval shlamim, the shlamim, you could slaughter in the whole courtyard. Maybe you don't need to maximize the space on top of the altar. I might have thought you can't slaughter it. Kamash malon. So therefore, we say that's what Rabbi Yossi says. The verse is telling us we could even slaughter the shlamim on top of the altar. So now let's analyze this phrase. That gufa. What phrase did we just say from the brisa? That Amar Rav Asi, Amar Rav Yochanan. Modi Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda Shem Shachtan Knegdam Mekarka Psulos. So Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda's position was that you could slaughter the Kachi Kachim on the northern part of the altar, but not on the southern part of the altar. But he himself would admit that if you slaughtered it on the Knegdan, meaning opposite the altar on the earth, it's disqualified. What does that mean? What does that phrase mean? My Knegdam Mekarka. So what does it mean? If you want to say, well, Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda would admit that if you slaughtered the animal on the amma, that is the yesod, i.e. on the base that went around, or the amma, that is the sovev, the ledge that was in the towards the top of the altar where the Kohanim walked around to apply the blood, it can't be. Hai gufa mizbeachu. That's actually part of the altar, so that's not kinegdem mekarka. Va'od, my kinegdem mekarka. And also, it wouldn't explain the phrase kinegdem mekarka. V'chiteiman, if you want to say, da'avid mechilos bekarka. Okay, I can translate these words, but it's not clear exactly what it means. If you want to say he made like a tunnel in the ground or a dugout in the ground, mishachapahu, and he slaughtered it in this hole in the ground, you can't have the altar there. That wouldn't be kosher. The altar of the earth you should make for me. That you can't build this altar on top of a tunnel or on top of a dome. So it wouldn't be okay. So it wouldn't be an altar at all. So you can't even think that you should do it connect and bekarka. Meaning to say for sure it's no good there. So no, we're talking about a case where you cut off a little bit of the altar and slaughtered it there in that place where the altar was, or maybe you made a diminished altar and slaughtered it in the place where the altar was. There, Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda would admit that it's disqualified. Couple of points here. First of all, here it says that you can't slaughter the altar on top of tunnels or keeping, but there's other Gemara in Yerushalmi that says that they used to make the tunnels and the domes on the Temple Mount to determine that there were no dead bodies underneath. So they made like a little cavity to make sure that you weren't going over a dead body. So that we have to say that that was the rest of the Temple Mount, except for the place where the altar was. Now, why would you have diminished the altar? Why would you make the altar smaller? That's not okay. You're not allowed to make the altar smaller. So here, there's a few answers to this question. One answer is that they were making it smaller in order to fix it, and so it was under construction. Or maybe he did it. He made it smaller improperly, and now he's slaughtered there. Or maybe it was while they were in the process of building it. Anyway, this is an enigmatic phrase that we're talking about a case where you built a tunnel near the altar, it's disqualified, and then you slaughtered there, it's disqualified. Or you cut off the altar, you cut off a portion of the altar, and you slaughtered the animal there, it would also be disqualified. So anyway, going back, Rabbi Yochanan's explanation, there was a machokas in the Mishnah, a dispute between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda. If you slaughter the animal on the altar, would it be kosher? Rabbi Yossi says it would be kosher because it says, though you slaughtered it in the north. And Rav Asi quotes Rav Yochanan, who says that according to Rabbi Yossi, the entire altar was in the northern part of the courtyard. And that's why you could slaughter an animal on top of the altar. So that's Rabbi Yochanan's assertion that according to Rabbi Yossi, the entire altar was in the north. So Amar Rabbi Zera, after Isa lahad Rabbi Yochanan v'lo tanina l'b'masnisin. Is it possible that we have this teaching of Rabbi Yochanan and it wasn't explicit in a Mishnah? Meaning it has to be a source for it. There must be a source for this idea that Rabbi Yossi says that the whole altar was in the north. Nafak dak va'ashkach. Rabbi Zera went out and he found it. He said, I found my source for Rabbi Yochanan. This is from a Mishnah in Tamid. Tanan, Beru Misham Eitzeteina, that it says in the Mishnah in Tamid that when they were in the morning, when they had to make coals for the fire on the altar, and we'll see which fire they're talking about. There were multiple fires on the altar, dispute exactly how many, but they would take one of the fires and make coals to bring that fire to bring the coals into the sanctuary to use for the coals to burn the ketorah, the incense. So they went in there and they found 8 seita'ina. They took fig wood, even though you could use any wood for the altar except for grape vines and olive tree wood. Rashi says, al tam agadah, through homily, that because Adam and Eve used the fig tree for clothing, it was a takana for them, so therefore we use it for the altar. So they chose atse takana yafim. They used these atse te'ena yafim l'seder ma'arach hashniya shel ketoras, and they would take this wood and they used it for the second fire on the altar, which was for the incense. They were going to make coals for the incense, and it was kineged keren ma'aravis dromis. It was it was in the southwestern corner of the altar. Imagine you're walking from Mount of Olives onto the Temple Mount. You walk in from the east and you walk towards the sanctuary, which is in the west. Now the southwestern corner will be on your left and in front of you. So that's the southwestern corner. And there, it would be 4 amos away from the corner. That's where the fire was. And how much did they put on it? Ba'omer chamesh sa'in gecham. They put an amount that could bring out for you 5 seah of coals. Shabbos, and on Shabbos, ba'omer shmona sa'in gecham. On Shabbos, they need a little bit more. They need to give you more wood to get 8 seah of coals. Sheshama yunosnin shnei bezike levona shalachem apanam. On Shabbos they had to put the 2 spoons of the frankincense, so they had more stuff to burn. My simana, what is the rule that they had to establish for the second pier why did it have to be for the second fire on the altar? Why did it have to be 4 amos away towards the north from the southwest corner? What's the reason? How do we know that? My simana. What's the reason? Because that position is Rabbi Yossi. The Gemara is going to determine that Rabbi Yossi is the one who says that, and Rabbi Yossi therefore would have to be in the north. We'll see how. The Tanya, because it says in a brisa, on the top of 58b, Rabbi Yossi Omer Zestiman. Rabbi Yossi says this is the general rule. Kol anital bifnim, anything that is taken from inside the sanctuary, nasim b'chutz, to be placed on the altar, which is in the courtyard. Eino nisan el b'samach. You have to put it on the place closest. We already had this in our Gemara that earlier in our tractate, that you put it right when you came out on the western part of the altar to pour the blood from inside the sanctuary, from the inner chatas. And she'en koanita b'fnim munazim chutz en nosen al b'samach. She'en lifnim. You put it on the inside, on the place you come into, where there's nothing more close to the courtyard than that. She'en lifnim himenu, the closest possible point. The koanita b'chutz, and anything that's taken from the altar, i.e., to place inside the sanctuary, i.e., the coals, the hot coals. You only take it from the most close place to the entrance to the Ol Moed. So we know that Rabbi Yossi establishes a rule that whatever you take from inside the sanctuary to place outside, you have to put it on the first place you come. And whenever you take from the altar outside to place in the sanctuary, you take it from the closest place. And what's he teaching us about? The Gemara says, what's he talking about? To take it from the inside to place it outside. What are we talking about? If Rabbi Yossi is telling us that you pour the blood right on the western base of the altar, we don't need Rabbi Yossi to say that. That's explicit. It's explicit verse. And also anything that's taken from the outside to be placed inside the sanctuary. Again, what are we talking about? If you want to say it's the coals for the Yom Kippur, for the Holy of Holies incense, that's also explicit. And then the pasuk continues, so it's explicit that you take it from the closest part. So therefore, rather what it means is, what is he referring to there? Anything that's taken from inside to be brought on the altar outside, that's referring to the Shnei Bezike Levona. That's referring to the 2 spoons of frankincense, Shalachem Apanim. The Gamay Mishirayim, because we went up from the Shirayim, that it is supposed to be going straight onto the first space that it can, and even though the shirayim of the inner chatas were poured on the base, and this is put on the fire, it's the first possible space. And anital b'chutz linasim mifnim. Now, what is the stuff that's taken from the outside altar to be placed inside? That's gecholim the chol yoma. Those are the coals that you used every day, chol yoma v'yoma. That those are the incense, for the coals for the incense, which was brought in the morning and the afternoon. And so therefore the Gamra migacham sheyom Kippur. Now we learn out from Yom Kippur that it comes from the fire that was closest to the altar, i.e. the second fire on the Mizbeach. But now Rabbi Yossi is basically saying that altar, that the outer altar has the second fire. The second fire is 4 amos away from the southwestern corner, and that's the part that has to be right in front of the entrance into the Ol Moed. So the entrance into the Ol Moed, just a little bit of so for the next few lines, we need to. It's a little bit like arithmetic, math, or architecture, but it's not complicated. You just have to know a few basic facts. That the altar was 32 amos by 32 amos. An amos approximately a foot and a half, but let's just work in amos. The opening to the sanctuary is 10 amos wide, half in the north, half in the south. And the third factor that you need to bear in mind that on each side of the opening to the sanctuary, there was an ulam, which was the foyer, which was slightly longer, an additional 5 amos on each side. So again, we're trying to prove that Rabbi Yossi, who says this idea that the altar, that the fire was 4 amos away from the southwestern corner, he also is of the position that the entire altar was in the north. And we'll see how it has to be. So the Gemara says, my kasavar, what is Rabbi Yossi's position? Kasavar kuam is be'ach b'darim kai. If you want to say the entire altar is in the south, and so therefore when the fire winds up against the entrance, it can only be, the maximum it could be is to the part of the entrance that is in the southern part. So if that's the case, if the entire altar is in the north, is in the south, that means that it's 32 amos away from how many amos does it have to be minimum away? It needs to be a minimum away from the entrance into the sanctuary. It has to be a minimum of 27 amos away, because there's five amos, that the last 5 amos are the entrance in, and if it goes over that, so therefore the front of the altar is 32 amos away. So if you want to make it you want to make the fire opposite the sanctuary, it would have to be 27 amos away from the corner, not 4 amos. So that's the first thing. It can't be there. The altar can't be totally in the south. As Shiva by Lamesi. So because then it would need 27 amos. Okay, let's say you want to say, let's say the entrance to the sanctuary is defined not just by the actual entrance, but even by the foyer, the ulam. So, okay, add on another 5 amos, still it would need to be just 27 plus 5 is Esrim entirety by Macy. It would need to be 22 amos away from the southwestern corner. V'ikasavar chatzio b'safam l'chatzio b'darim. Okay, so let's say you want to say it was half in the north, half in the south, 16 amos in the south. So then how many amos would it need to be away from the southwestern corner to hit the center point? 11 amos it would need to be away, because then it's 11 amos away from the entrance. So it needs to be 11. And if you want to say, okay, let's add on another 5 from the ulam, we'll say the ulam is part of the center, still shit by lamesi. It would still need to be 6 away, not 4 away. Alav mishum de kasavar must be of the position kulam is beach but safon kai. Must be that the whole altar is in the north. And so if that's the case, why does the fire need to be 4 amos away from the southwestern corner? Mahani arba amos, the reason why it needs to be 4 amos away from the southwestern corner is, this is what it's referring to. Amma of the yesod, it has to be 1 amma away from the base, and amma sovev, 1 amma in from the ledge, the amma makom kronos, 1 from the horns, and then amma makom raglei kohanim. Then the kohanim, just practically speaking, you need 1 place for the kohanim to stand. And if you would go more than that, then you'd be beyond the entrance anymore, because then it would be 5 already, and you're no longer in front of the opening at that point. And so that's why it proves that Rabbi Yossi is of the position that the whole altar is in the north. And this is the source for Rabbi Yochanan, who says that this is a Tanaitic source that for Rabbi Yochanan to say that Rabbi Yossi says the whole altar is in the north. You had a question, Jeff?
Yeah, where did we get that it had to be in the southwest corner?
Rabbi Yossi said that on the bottom of 58a, the Brisa says, the Mishnah and comment says that the Marach HaShniel of the second fire of the Ketores is Keneged Keren Maravis Dromis, Mashach Min HaKeren Klapei Tzafon Arba Amos. It says explicitly, it's 4 amos away from the southwest corner.
Where Rabbi Yossi is the author of that.
So that's what we're arguing, that Rabbi Yossi is the author of that Mishnah, because Rabbi Yossi said this is the sign. He gave a sign for it. and he says this is the sign called Nita Bafnim Nasim Mechutz, and it's to take the fire from the second fire to use for the Ketores. So we assume that Rabbi Yossi is applying that. We're going to see that they're going to challenge that that's not Rabbi Yossi, but that's the assumption here. So
they're assuming 4 amos perpendicular to one diagonal.
Yeah, well, at this point, they're assuming that's what is needed. That's straight out.
It's all necessary that it's on.
That's Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda. Look in the Mishnah. There's Rabbi Yossi versus Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, right? You see that? 2 opinions. One is Rabbi Yossi, one is Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda. So the Gemara rejects this. The Gemara says, no, that's not the source for Rabbi Yochanan. Amrav Ad, for that Rabbi Yochanan attribute this Mishnah to Rabbi Yossi, this position to Rabbi Yossi. What?
This is Ke'ilu.
Right.
Rabbi Yossi is Ke'ilu.
The Gemara asked, what? Well, then you have to look. We said at the beginning, because the Gemara asked that question right at the beginning. Why did it say Ke'ilu? The Gemara asked that question right at the very beginning. The Gemara says, so you might have thought that that's the first question who asked. My Ke'ilu, you might have said you need on the side of the altar, and that's not it. So therefore we say it's as though it's in the north, even though it's not on the side of the altar. That was the first question the Gemara asked on the Mishnah. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Ada bar Ava, so Rav Ada bar Ava says, oh wait, gotta finish this. No, who is the source? Don't prove that Rabbi Yossi is the one who says that the author is in the north, because we could say, who is the author of this Mishnah? Hamani, this is the author of this Mishnah who says that it's 4 amos away is Rabbi Yossi. It's Rabbi Yossi, because he says that the altar was in the middle of the courtyard. That the altar was directly in the middle of the courtyard. And the altar was, we know, and we do the math. The altar was 32 amos. So the altar was 32 amos. 10 of those amos were taken up being opposite the entrance of the sanctuary. And then achasesrei amos mikan v'achasesrei amos mikan. So we're left with 11 amos on each side. Nimtza mizbeach mekuvan keneged heichal. So we see that the altar is opposite. We see that the altar is directly opposite it. So we see from here, the Gemara says that shouldn't solve anything. So for Rabbi Yehuda, he still has to move at 11, not 4. So the Gemara says, well, okay, so no, we add on another 5. So he's 6 away. The entrance is 6 away from the edge of the altar, but still you should have to add 6. The Gemara says, no, no, when it says that you have to move it 4 amos away, that just means after you deduct an amma for the yesod and an amma for the soveins. So it means arba amos bar me amma yesod v'amma sovein. Okay, so the Gemara says, okay, so once we're establishing that the altar was directly in the middle and it's not a source that the entire altar was in the north, nukma Rabbi Yossi b'mumtza. So why do you want to say that this Mishnah is like Rabbi Yehuda? Why don't we say it's like Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda, where it's in the Mishnah? Why do we have to say that it's like Rabbi Yehuda? It could still be like Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. So the Gemara says, Mishum Rabbi Yehuda shemanale mutza beheja, because we heard that Rabbi Yehuda says this explicitly, that the altar is in the north. Therefore, Avada wanted to say it's like him. But really, he could have said, he could have rejected the proof that Rabbi Yossi says it's entirely in the north by just saying it's possible to understand it and that it would be in the middle as well. So again, the Gemara is left trying to prove that Rabbi Yochanan has a source. The Rabbi Yossi says the whole Mishnah is the whole altar is in the north, and that'll be for tomorrow's daf. There's going to be a third approach where we say that a third rejection, where he says that this Mishnah could actually be like Rabbi Yossi Aglili and not like Rabbi Yossi. But that'll be for tomorrow's daf. Yeshikoach. Anybody have any questions?